Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark.
Stories to Listen to When You Drive, Volume 10, Story Number 1. I was about 15 minutes from finishing the night shift at work when there was a massive crash on one of the windows in the office, so I got up and went to check it out. Someone had thrown quite a sizable rock through one of the windows on the front of the building. This is made especially weird because I'm working in an industrial district at 11:30 p.m. at night, when none of the other businesses are even open. I went back to my desk, put a quick call through the security and let them know what happened, and after that I decided to head home. As I was leaving the building, I was freaking myself out about it more and more and ended up running to my car, got in and took off. I was almost home and I started to calm down a little bit when I realized that I didn't unlock my car when I got in. It had been unlocked the whole time. I did a quick check with my hand in the back seat for any possible murderers that might be hanging around there, but nothing's there. Fast forward 30 minutes. Called a friend of mine who said he was out drinking, so I decided I might as well join him. I jumped on my bike and started riding over. I'm doodling along the road on my bike. It's a nice night, and I'm in no big rush, just enjoying the moonlight, when I hear someone riding behind me. I straightened up and went over to the side of the road, and he passes me really slow, and when he's right beside me, this guy shoots me a smile I can only describe as purely effing insane. I kind of flinched. I was taken aback as he just rode on, and that's when I realized it. He's riding my mother's bike. Needless to say, I sprinted all the way back home. When I get there, sure enough, her bike is missing, and one of my car doors is open, the back left one. I was driving and had no need to open that door at all. Story number 2. When I was a kid, it was my first time staying home alone while my whole family went out to my brother's ball game. I think I was about 13. Anyway, I'm on the phone with a friend of mine feeling so grown up when someone beeps in on the other line. I tell her I'll be right back and click over the line. Then the creepiest voice I've ever heard says, "Hello, little girl. I'm the man in your basement." Honestly, I laughed it off and just hung up thinking it was a prank call. I was a pretty confident little thing, and my neighborhood was pretty safe, so I figured someone was just messing with me, knowing it was my first time alone. They beeped in again, so I clicked over and heard, "Don't you effing hang up on me, you little you know what." And the light started flickering and there was banging under my feet. I know it sounds crazy, but my dog started freaking out and my cat ran away, so I assure you I wasn't imagining a thing. Our basement was actually just an area connected to the garage. It wasn't finished. I heard what sounded like footsteps coming up the garage steps to get into our kitchen, and I threw stuff in front of the door and was hearing yelling and whatnot. I kept trying to hang up and call the cops, but every time I tried to, he was still on the phone. My friend told her parents what was happening, and they ran to the neighbor's house to call the police for me. I sat petrified with a broken rifle, a butcher knife, and a baseball bat behind my front door because it was the only place in the house downstairs that couldn't be seen from a window, and I was crying a lot. Eventually, I clicked over to hear a police dispatcher on the phone and stayed on the line with her until the police got to my house. There was no sign of forced entry, though we had a broken window pane on our outside garage door that had been messed up for months prior, and my guess he used that to get in. The police assumed I was a paranoid girl just because I'd been left home alone. Fortunately, a family friend was driving by and saw the cops there and stopped to see if everything was okay. He gave me a ride to the school where my family was at. They were skeptical that anything had happened, but we did get a security system not too much longer after that, and my parents both got cell phones. This was around 1994. I think so. Cell phones were not exactly popular yet. After that happened, I swear, that there was someone stalking me for years. I would leave my apartment locked and bolted and come back to find appliances on, hair dryer, stove, heat on in the middle of the summer. I lived in 4 different places and would get strange phone calls at every one of those locations despite being unlisted. Cars would randomly be parked down the road from my house and speed up and slam on the brakes as I would run inside. I'd hear loud bangs outside when I lived out in the country. Nothing happened since I've been in my current house, and I'm married, but I'm still super paranoid all the time. But truth be told, can you blame me? Next story. In 2007, I finished college. I was offered a post as an admin in a small town working with local law enforcement. It was a 6-month contract and paid really well. So within a week, I accepted the job, found a furnished place to live in, and took off for my adventure. The town was just over 15,000 people only, and the apartment I chose was on the top floor of a 3-story building that was built in the 1960s. It was quite large and had nice hardwood floors. The walls were somewhat thin, and I heard my neighbors a few times, especially at night when it was quiet. When I first got there, I knocked a few times with the intention to introduce myself, but they never answered, even though I thought I heard them inside. After a week, I assumed maybe it was a reclusive person, so I slipped a note under the door saying hello. I worked with the same officers all the time on rotating shifts, and 3 weeks into my stay, I was in the afternoon shift, which meant I was getting home around 2 a.m. As I came down the hallway of the building, I saw a light coming from under my neighbor's door and saw the shadow of feet under the door, and the peephole went dark as if they heard me and were looking to see who was in the hall. I figured if they wanted to say hello, they would have opened the door, so I simply waved hello and went into my apartment. Over the next couple of weeks, this happened 3 to 4 times again. I was pretty sure I had a reclusive but nosy neighbor. Then one night after work, I crawled into bed at 3 a.m. and could hear that my neighbor was moving around in the room of theirs that adjoined my bedroom. About 10 minutes later, the noises got louder, and it started to get me worried. They had never been this loud, and it almost sounded as they were being attacked, or having a heart attack, and knocking things over. I ran out of the apartment and started knocking loudly on their door, but they didn't answer. I called out to them saying I was worried about them, and if they didn't answer, I would call for help. Still no answer. I ran back into my apartment and could hear bangs through the walls, so I called the police station and asked my coworker to send an officer. I went and knocked on my neighbor's door one more time, but no answer, and then headed down to the lobby to wait for the officer, who showed up within 5 minutes. I'd gotten to know him a bit, and we went up and knocked on the door, but still no answer. I took him into my apartment, and we could still hear loud thumps every 5 to 10 seconds, and then a huge bang. The officer asked if I could go get the building manager to open the door. She lived 1 block away, so I said I'd run over and get her. Luckily, she was a night owl and watching TV. I told her that my neighbor was being really loud and wouldn't answer the door, so she grabbed the key and we headed over. The officer was waiting for us in the lobby, and she asked which apartment it was, and I told her 304. She looked at me weirdly and said 304 was empty. I said I'd heard my neighbor making noise nearly every day and had seen the light on and shadows under the door a few times. The officer said he heard the noises too and asked if 304 was the apartment that was above the carport, and she said yes. He replied that someone could easily climb up onto the carport and perhaps there were squatters in the empty apartment. We went up and the manager unlocked the door and the officer opened it. The apartment was dark and he turned the light on. He went in and the manager and I were peeking in through the doorway. He went into the bedroom and came back and said it was empty. We went in and the place was spotless. All but 2 of the windows were locked and no sign of squatters. We all just stood there scratching our heads. The officer looked at me and said, "You're not crazy. I heard the banging too." I said maybe we scared them off and they had come and gone through the unlocked windows. We double-checked that all the windows were locked and headed out. On our way out, I looked down and there on the floor was a note I had slipped under the door a few weeks earlier. We locked the apartment and I said I'd keep an eye out and call them both if I ever again saw the light on or heard noises. Fast forward almost 6 weeks and I was again on afternoon shifts. I came home at 2 a.m. and there was a light on. I quickly went into my bedroom and could hear thumping from next door. I called the station and asked for an officer to come out and then called my building manager. I slipped down to the lobby and waited for them. A different officer showed up and I knew him too. My building manager arrived and all three of us headed upstairs. The light was off and the building manager unlocked the door. The officer went in and everything checked out. We checked the windows again and they were all still locked. I apologized and tried to rationalize it that I had just come off 4 days of 14-hour shifts and was tired, but I knew I had seen the light on and heard thumping. 2 weeks later, the apartment was rented out and I got a chance to greet my new neighbors. I told them to keep an eye out because we were sure squatters had been coming in and out, and I relayed the stories to them. My final week there, the station had a barbecue and we were talking about the squatters that no one ever saw. I told the first officer about the second call and how all the windows were locked that time, but I knew I had seen the light on and heard thumping next door. He asked if I wanted to hear something funny, and I said sure. He said he was going to tell me earlier but didn't want to freak me out. He proceeded to tell me that 3 months before I moved in, he personally responded to a call to my neighbor's apartment for a very bloody suicide. The person had done the deed but had second thoughts and called for help. When they arrived, the person was unconscious but had obviously panicked, and a chair, lamp, and side table had been knocked over, and there was blood everywhere. Unfortunately, they passed away before getting to the hospital. I just stared at him, and he reminded me he had heard the banging too the night I called him over. I asked the building manager about it the day I moved out, and asked why she hadn't told me. She laughed and said, "Oh, honey, I believe in ghosts, but didn't know if you did too, and I didn't want to scare you. I knew you heard and saw things. I believed you, and I doubted it was squatters." Next story. I used to work night shift security in a college campus, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., usually by myself. I was lucky to have a co-study student officer with me until 2. The campus had been around in one form or another since the Revolutionary War. Started as a wood fort, then stone, then finally a concrete fortress with dozens of brick buildings until the end of World War II, when they decommissioned the fort and turned it into a college. There's one building on campus that used to be an officer's quarters, a really fancy, rather upscale 3-story house. The place has all the classic ghost stories: lady in white, shadows moving on their own, footsteps, etc. I never believed them until I experienced them. The temperature drops. My first experience in there, I was still on second shift during the day. It was maybe 4 p.m. I remember the sun was still out. It was also in the 80s outside. I was crossing the main lobby, a large room in front of the double staircase, when I realized something. It was suddenly way too quiet, like the air was heavy and pressing down on me. I stopped walking for some reason. Then it got cold, really cold. It must have dropped about 20 degrees. Needless to say, I booked it before I heard or saw anything. I've seen horror movies. Then there was the scream. Another experience with this place was the screaming. I was escorting a couple of new officers to show them how to lock the building. We were standing in the lobby. Everything seemed to be focused there. Talking to the last guy in the building. 4 of us standing in a group, when all but one of us heard it. Shuffling like something being dragged in short spurts across the floor directly above us. Scrunch, scrunch, scrunch. And then this woman screaming. But there was nobody up there. I wanted to check it out, but the female officer I was next to was too creeped out. And then there was the child laughing. It must have been a few months after the scream incident. I hadn't gone through there much since then. I was escorting another new guy, and had just finished telling him the story about the scream. We were standing next to the back door. Once again, this room was directly connected to the lobby, with a rather large arch connecting them instead of a door. As we started walking into the lobby, a familiar feeling crept over me. It was quiet and heavy. That's when we heard it. I'm pretty sure I heard the pitter-patter of little footsteps, but we both heard it. A little girl, giggling, on the floor above us. The building was empty and already locked up. We were doing second checks. There was no way somebody else was in there. The previous patrols would have found them. We looked at each other and booked it out the door. And then there was the woman in the black heels. This is the last thing I experienced in that building. In fact, It's the only thing I saw outright. I was working alone that night. There were still two staff members in the building, one in the basement, one at the front desk. As I was locking the doors, they were finishing their tasks and getting ready to leave. I double-checked the building, turned off some lights, and started crossing the lobby when I looked up the staircase. The staircase runs parallel to the lobby. It goes up half a floor to the landing, then the rest of the way in a switchback setup. There was a woman up there on the second floor. All I could see was the bottom of a black skirt, her legs, and black heels, walking from the right to the left. She was wearing heels, but there was no sound, and even though she was walking at a regular pace, I blinked and she was gone. I didn't believe in ghosts until I became a security officer on that night shift, because there's just no way not to believe. Next story. The only time I ever got really spooked, I was in the woods turkey hunting in the mountains of Colorado. The night before, I had found a lone tom in the woods and could not get close enough for a shot, so I figured it would be a good place to come back to the next night. I planned on setting up in the same spot and waiting until dark. Now granted, I'm not afraid of the dark. I've hiked in the dark a lot by myself, so the dark doesn't really scare me. Well, anyway, I set up in front of a big ponderosa tree, my bow in one hand, and planned on waiting until it was dark, hoping the bird might show up again to roost before making the long hike back to my truck. Well, I'm sitting there when all of a sudden I heard a loud snap, like a stick breaking. The sound came from right behind me. I slowly turned my head and found nothing to be there. Whatever was there spooked me pretty bad. My hair stood up on my neck, and I got the vibe to get out of there. So I reacted and followed my instinct and headed back to the truck, a lot earlier than planned. Along the way, I came over a hill and something caught my eye in the form of a bone. I went in that direction. Maybe it was an elk shed or something. My eyes are constantly searching. The white bone that caught my eye was a human skull with a bullet hole in the side of it. I tried to tell myself that it couldn't be, but then again, we don't have any monkeys in Colorado. Once again, I felt that weird feeling that something was watching me. So I continued on. I reached my truck and then headed home. Called the sheriff, and the following morning led CSI unit out to the skull. Ended up that I solved an 8-year-old missing person case. Not sure what spooked me so bad, but whatever it was, it made me leave earlier than planned, and in turn found the body. Perhaps it was the boy's spirit. Next story. I assure you that this story is 100% true, and it changed several people in bad ways. I was 18 at this time, accompanied by 3 others who were the same age. We decided to go out and rough it for a night with a camping trip. The area we went to was accessible only by ATV, and it sat right at the bank of the creek visible on a map. This giant bend in the creek is referred to as King's Bend by the locals and is known for good fishing in the day and a place to avoid like the plague at night. Here's a little backstory that I discovered after the event happened. There are 2 train tunnels that run under the hills in this area. They were built way back in the day by cheap labor, and the workers who died during this process were buried in shoddy, unmarked graves close to where we camped. There's also a large field to the east of the campsite. It has a house on it, which I believe is used by West Virginia state troopers as a campground. The reason it's used by them is that it was possessed by the state after a shootout occurred in which several members of a local gang of bad men were killed by the police in a raid. Just up the creek, a ways from our site, a large old dead tree hangs out over the water where a man hung himself many years earlier. Also, I wish I'd known about all these things before we went camping. A woman and her child drowned in a canoe accident, and from what I learned, directly in the creek in front of our camping site. So, with all of that out of the way, remember that we had no clue of any of this as we went down that night. My cousins, friend, and I gathered up our camping supplies, fishing poles, food, etc., and headed down while the sun was still up, although close to setting. In the last hours of the day, we started our fire, set up our tent, and started goofing off. Mind you, there was no alcohol, drugs, or any other things that would have impaired our perceptions. This was all witnessed, felt, or heard by everyone involved. It was long, long after the sunset, total darkness was upon us, that the first sign that something wasn't right began. My cousin and I were sitting on the bank of the creek, roughly 30 feet from our camping site. We had a spotlight, shining it down on the water, spotting fish and trying to spear them. We weren't very successful, but that's not the important part. After about 3 minutes of doing this, we noticed that every time we would shut the light off, we would hear a whoosh, whoosh in the water. Very distinctly the sound of someone sloshing through water. When we turned the light back on, you could see waves and ripples in the water. Not slight ripples that could be caused by a fish or something else, but very heavy, rough ripples that needed weight to cause it. There were also two sets of ripples, about the distance apart a human would create if they were wading through water. When we turned the spotlight off, it started again. Turn it back on, it stopped, but the water was disturbed. The truly scary thing about this is that it was headed across the creek towards us. This alone was not enough to cause concern, but my cousin and I looked at each other thinking, that's weird, but we went on about our business. Sitting back at the campsite, with the fire raging in front of us, we started shooting the breeze and enjoying the night. However, it wasn't long before once again weird things started. We heard voices echoing off the hillside. They were more like whispers, but they were loud, if that makes any sense. At first, this wouldn't be cause for alarm as people hunt for raccoon out there all the time, especially at night. However, the voices never got louder, never got softer. We also did not hear any dogs, which is a necessity to hunt raccoons. They stayed the same volume again, and we couldn't figure that out. So it was like one voice was whispering into our collective ears. We looked around our immediate area, nothing. There were tall weeds, grasses in the area around our campsite, and once or twice it sounded like someone ran through them. Solid thuds in the ground, grass thrashing, and moving violently. This is the only event I will write about that I can 100% contribute to the paranormal, as it could have been an animal, but in hindsight I don't think so. The fear had begun to sink in. At first the voice was very hushed, indistinct, but clearly audible. After about 2 or 3 minutes, it started to become more apparent. The voice was whispering about us. What are they doing here? They need to leave. You shouldn't be here. If this sounds like something out of a horror novel, I am 1000% inclined to agree with you. At this point, sheer panic broke out. We decided at that moment to leave quickly. The ATV was parked just out of firelight, still visible but faintly. As I stood up, looked at my friends and told them that we needed to go, I started to jog towards the ATV to get it started while my friends got what they absolutely couldn't leave behind that night. I was looking over my shoulder at first, and when I turned to look ahead at the ATV, I was literally frozen in place at what I saw. Standing just beside the ATV, under a tree, was the outline of a tall man and what looked like a hat. You could see no details. It was just blackness. You could see through it. It was kind of transparent, but what was beyond looked twisted and distorted, like looking through water or something. There were no red eyes, as I've read in other encounters of such things, but I'm sure there are variants of every type of supernatural thing. He had no feet. It just sort of ended at his ankles in wavy lines, almost like what heat waves look like above a fire. My heart sank into my stomach. An undeniable feeling of fear and revulsion took over. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I was rooted on the spot from the moment I laid eyes on it. This is the moment where I realized, holy crap, ghosts are real. My cousin came up just beside me at that time and saw it too. He was also just frozen on the spot. After about 10 or 15 seconds, I don't really know, but it seemed like an eternity, it sort of zipped back in the direction of the train tunnels. The best way I can describe it is, if you remember the Flash, how he had sort of an outline of himself behind him as he moved really fast, just like that. It just went very, very quickly back into the darkness and disappeared. We got on that ATV and hauled out of there with full fury, like the hounds of hell were on our tail, because for all we knew they were. We spent the night indoors, wide awake, scared to death, while we tried to rationalize and make sense of what we had just experienced. It wasn't until afterwards that I learned about all the things I described before. And I heard from men who are hard men, guys who show no fear to any living thing, that I wouldn't want to cross under any circumstances, that even they avoid that area at night. Nobody goes through that section after the sun goes down. We didn't know this, of course, or we would have heeded their advice. If any of this sounds unbelievable, I don't blame you one bit. But if someone told me this story, I would laugh at them and call them a storyteller, etc. I'm not one to tell stories myself, and I can tell you that what I described did happen, and it changed my life. It really led me to question life, death, and what happens afterwards. An interesting addition to the story is my uncle, who owns the land, was out hunting with a dog at night. He was standing below a large rock face, and the dog was up on top. It knocked a large rock loose that fell and struck my uncle in the neck. He was paralyzed on the right side of his body. Somehow, he got his ATV turned around and drove himself out of the woods. After I told the story just described, he messaged my mother. My uncle is not one to joke around. He's a funny guy, but he doesn't lie. He abhors liars. He told my mother that he had never told anyone this, but that the man in the hat, the way we saw him down by the creek that night, helped him get his ATV turned around and helped him get on it. That completely blew my mind, and I do not doubt until this very day that he was telling the truth. Next story. This happened between 1986 and 1987. My father bought a farm in the Free State province of South Africa, which the locals call Kapamandi. It's Sotho, a native African language for the place where the blood flows. The first week or so everything went without incident. I was about 3 at the time, so this story is partly what I remember, mostly what I've been told. Around the third night or so of the second week, there came a knock at the master bedroom window. My dad opened a curtain to find no one there. Just as he got into bed, the knock came again, but this time from the kitchen at the other end of the house. My dad got up, but again found no one there. As he turned his back on the door, all hell broke loose. The knocking started again, but went in rapid succession from one window to the other, covering the whole house. As my dad gathered all of us together, it suddenly started raining rocks. It went on like this for the rest of the night until the first African plovers started their calls in the morning. Then all went silent. Apparently, it did not only torment us as the owners of the farm workers who were left the next morning didn't want to start work out of fear for the Tokoloshi, a small, hairy, mischievous spirit used by witch doctors to do their bidding, as they believed it, were responsible for the phenomena. Most workers even left the same day. Things slowly escalated from there, as if testing my parents' tolerance. Lots of times I called for my mom while playing, bathing, etc., telling her to make the uncle leave, only for her to find no one around. Other spirits also started appearing around the house and garden. I believe that these were former owners and inhabitants of our farm. They appeared to be wearing clothes from the earlier 1900s. An older gentleman in his 60s haunted the house, smoking a pipe. The smell of pipe smoke would sometimes fill the living room, with a young man around his early 30s. One bright sunny day, we'd see a woman in her 30s cutting roses from the formal garden. A young girl around 5 years old ran around her mother, both of them wearing bonnets, as was the custom among Boer folk for centuries. A few nights later, my family heard the neighing of horses in the old stone kraal, a type of cattle or livestock enclosure. There was the sound of hoofs on the ground, the muted voices of men talking or discussing something, and the sound of the heavy iron gate swaying open, followed by a voice calling, "Voorwaarts, man." It roughly translates from Afrikaans, which is closely related to Dutch, to "charge, men." The horses would then bolt from the open gates, circling the house accompanied by the sound of horsewhips. This usually lasted around 30 minutes every night. The creepy part is that the kraal was used by the Boers during the Anglo-Boer War of 1899. There are also some British graves in the middle of one of the cornfields as reminders of a Boer victory during some unnamed battle in 1900. One day my mother cried out in fear. Our healthy Boerbell dogs were lying on their backs with their eyes turned back in their sockets, their mouths foaming. At first my parents thought the animals had been poisoned. My father fetched the pickup, put the dogs on one back, and rushed towards town to take them to a vet. Just as my father exited the gate at the border of the farm, the dog suddenly got up and acted as if nothing was wrong. This continued countless times, with the dogs immobilized for up to 15 minutes. Things quickly got worse from this point on. The sound of stones raining on the corrugated roof got worse, and the entity started finding human targets. My father and my 17-year-old brother were on the patio one evening when a stone hit my brother on the forehead. My father and brother both described the sound as a high-pitched whizzing noise, as if the stone had been hurled from a slingshot. The next day my father installed powerful spotlights around the house and cut out all the lovely fruit trees surrounding the home down in an attempt to catch the culprits. It was all to no avail. Everything continued as usual with no one in sight. It seemed as if the rocks being thrown materialized from thin air. At this stage the activity started to focus on my brother. He stayed in his one-bedroom flat about 10 meters from the main house. One night he was studying for a year-end exam when something unseen attacked him from behind. My brother was big and strong, typical Afrikaner rugby player type, and into bodybuilding at that time, but a struggle ensued with the creature trying to strangle him for what he said was quite a few minutes. But my brother finally broke loose from the creature's grip. He was covered in blood and looked like he'd been strangled with a garrote wire. His chest looked like it had been slashed by claws or blunt metal blades. Today in his 40s, he still bears the scars on his chest. My brother was not the only victim, as it turned out. My mom was lying on the bed one day reading a book when she suddenly became paralyzed. Shortly thereafter, a bulldog appeared at the bedroom door. My mother said it felt like eternity as she soaked in every detail of the entity. It also was a Boerbell dog, but he had a white spot between his eyes, whereas ours had black masks. Its face was tinted reddish pink, as if by blood, and red slime dripped from its mouth. The dog then started towards her, jumping on the bed, pinning her down, and staring into her eyes. After what must have felt like an eternity, the dog jumped off and left the room. This happened a few times more, even at night, with my father next to her. Being paralyzed, my mother could not alert my father. Being a stout Protestant Christian, my aunt did not believe the accounts she heard from my mother, so she came to visit with my niece, who was around 15 at the time. My sister and my niece were sitting in the bath when a stone flew through the window and cracked the tub between them. My aunt decided to brave the night and sleep over, but when we woke up the next morning, my aunt and niece were gone. They'd packed their bags in the middle of the night and drove the nearly 400 kilometers home. I actually admire her for her bravery, as she had to go outside and walk the 20 meters to her car. She said something happened in the spare bedroom shortly after she switched off the lights, but she refused to tell us what happened to this very day. Although the activity usually started around dusk and continued until the first African plovers called in the early morning hours, activity started to happen during daylight hours as well. There would be whispering around the house as two dark shadows moved around. These same two dark shadows also circled the house every night. We believed that they were the cause of the poltergeist activity. It actually was reported by the natives that tokoloshis usually worked in pairs. At this point, the only time the activity ceased was when the police or people who did not have a close bond to the family visited. It immediately resumed after they left. Around this time, spontaneous fires started around the employees' homes. It started out almost harmless, but one day some of the employees began bashing at the door screaming that one of the other workers' house was burning down and that the flames were leaping from the windows. The worker was on leave and the door was locked from the outside with a strong deadbolt. When they finally opened the door, witnesses saw that the only edges of the kitchen cupboards were burning. After the flames were extinguished and all the smoke subsided, they were shocked to find that there was no damage apart from the burst windows and smoke damage. My parents now got desperate as my father had put all of their savings into a deposit for the farm. Selling it then would have financially ruined them. The church did not seem to care, and he even alleged that my parents did this for attention. My parents used to be respected people in town, as my father was head of the traffic department and a deacon in church. Suddenly people laughed behind their backs, and most in town had abandoned my family at this stage. Some even accused my brother of staging it all. My dad now was being fed up that nothing worked and contacted a traditional African witch doctor from the old Botswana. When the witch doctor came, he asked for a glass of water, looked into it, and told my father things of a very personal nature, things very few people knew. Certainly no one in town knew. The witch doctor started to perform a cleansing ritual before he moved a few boxes filled with stuff like fingernail clippings, hair, etc. He then went on to tell my dad that the previous owner had put a curse on the farm, as he was very upset because he went bankrupt and wanted no one else to stay for long. That night, after the cleansing, a storm came up, and instead of thunder, there was a crying of a baby, which was very freaky. The wind blew from one border fence of the farm to the other, about 1,500 hectares, and almost everything stopped, as suddenly as it had started. Most people don't believe my story, but trust me, sometimes the truth really is stranger than fiction.